I would say to give George a round of applause because that's probably the longest passage we've read in the 5 years of Soul Grace. And I realized that I hampered him because I made it extremely small font. So sorry, George. That was my fault. I didn't change the font settings, but you're good. George is good. He's on the ball. This story, we've been going through, for those of you who haven't been here the last many weeks, this character, David, one of the most written about in all the Bible. We've been walking through the characters in his life. Now we're looking at David to ask the question, what can we learn from his life? After all, the premise is that David, penned most of the book of Psalms. So these songs of outpouring of his heart, and of his emotions and of his pains and his trials. And so we say, we're looking at these book of Psalms, and we want to look at the person who wrote these Psalms to say, what can we learn then about his life? What does it teach us? So last week, if you weren't here, just to catch you up to speed where we are in the context of this story, David last week was a little guy, and he gets chosen to be the new king. He's going to be the main king. He's going to be the king of all kings, but he's not just there yet. He's anointed, but he's not the king yet. Saul still is. And here in the story that George read, to recap it quickly, you have these two armies, the Israelite army and the Philistines. They didn't like each other. And they're encamped on a ridge, overlooking this valley at each other. Strategically, from a military standpoint, that's what you did. You went to the high place. And of course, your enemy would have to run down the hill and back up the hill, so you gain a strategic advantage. So they're sort of at a stalemate with each other, these armies. Who was going to blink first? Who was going to attack? Now, as I said, if you've never read the Bible, or if you haven't been to church much, or if you have, you know this story, do you not? David and Goliath. The famous David and Goliath story. And I'm going to venture to guess that if you're anything like me, you've heard this story told this way. As a way to say that Goliath is the symbolization or the embodiment of all fears. So Goliath's what's supposed to be your fear in life. And commonly what I've heard from church is that David is your inspiration. To say that you can go and tackle any fear, no matter how hard it is, you just run headlong into battle and you face it head on. And we have the phrase, the bigger they are, the harder they fall, right? So we get that from the story. That's predominantly the way that this story is given. And if you look at it that way, if you say that Goliath is just the visage of fear, he's fear in your life. He's conflict, he's battles, he's what you're going to have to fight through. You're going to have Goliaths come up in your life. Just dare to be a David and run at it. You have missed the complete and utter nuance of this story. You missed the entire point of it. I'm here to say this way. Goliath this morning does not represent, or this afternoon, fear, and David necessarily the answer to conquering your personal fear. I'm not going to tell you this afternoon to just relate to David. Put yourself in the story and be a David. Because that kind of courage, taking your little sling, which isn't that little, we'll look at that in a second, and going as a little young lad and fighting your battles head on, that will work at times, but at other times it'll crush you. And it's a shallow understanding of this particular narrative. It doesn't capture what the real point is. Goliath, I will argue, is not the embodiment of fear, but rather, he's a form of courage. He's a form of courage, believe it or not. Goliath is a model for you and me of one way that we can go about tackling fear in our lives and the things we have to fight for in the battles. He's one way, a flawed way. And I'll explain what I mean by that. He's not the symbolization of fear, but rather, he's courage, but the wrong type. And David, on the other hand, is another type of courage, but I'm not going to tell you this afternoon, be a David and go confront your fears head on. Muster up enough strength. Can you do that? Breathe. Go. Rah, rah. No, it's not a pep rally tonight. Because you'll have missed the entire beauty of who and what David not only represents, but who he points to. The real answer for you and me is when we have fears in our life, when we have battles, conflicts, struggles, frustrations, hills to climb, adversity smacking us in the face, this is the answer. but not the way you probably thought about it. Let me explain. First, I call it, you can follow in your outline, a Goliath courage. Because believe it or not, he's a type of courage. He's going into battle, which is fear, can strike fear into you. And even though he's big and tall, he's going into battle. And what's interesting about Goliath is the way in which he displays courage in the battle. But it's a flawed way, and it's a failed way. First, let me explain what the significance of Goliath is. In the translation that we read this afternoon, you said that it says that out of the camp of the Philistines came a champion. And some of your texts may say came an infantryman or came a soldier. Champion's the better word, and here's why. Because in the Hebrew word for this, champion literally is a word that means standing in between. Goliath was a man who stood in between. What does that mean? The battle lines are set, and Goliath comes out for 40 days, and he calls out one person, and they say, he's the champion. It doesn't mean he always wins. What it means is this. It means he goes forward to stand between the other army and his army. Goliath is the champion because he fights for his people. He represents them. See, we don't do this that much in our modern culture, but this was a way back then that you saved an enormous amount of bloodshed. You sent out one person, and you said, if you can beat their one other person, then we'll be your slaves, and vice versa. That's what Goliath says. He is going out to fight on behalf of his people. He's going into battle. The winning person won over the other army. And so here's Goliath, and he's going into battle. And I know, look, here's the symbolism. You go into battles all your life. Almost every day, if not every week, every month, you're going to be fighting something. You're going to be fighting fears. You're going to be going into adversity. That's what's happening here. And look at the symbolism, and look how rich it is. And look at the way Goliath does it versus the way David does it. Goliath, it says he's 6 cubits in a span. What that means, we think, roughly about 7 feet tall. Around about, we think. Which at this time was enormously tall in this region. And it says that he has a very intricately woven bronze armor that we think calculate weighed about 125 pounds. And they talk at great length about all of the details of Goliath, his armor, his weaponry. If you look through the Bible, you actually don't see many other times that the enemies are described with such detail. What's going on here? The writer's going to great lengths to say, look, this is one type of champion. This is one type of way to battle your fears, to have courage. And you know what it represents? He was powerful. He was strong. He was high tech. He was sophisticated. His armor was highly sophisticated. Goliath, as a champion, represented power, strength. And he steps out on the battlefield, and what does he do? In the midst of the fight, Goliath shows courage, yes, but a very flawed sense. What does he do? He hurls insults. He trumpets his own sense of power. He rattles his spear, and he shows off this fine weaponry. He's blustering. How does Goliath deal with his fears? Puff up your chest. Fight it. Show off. Be powerful. Be strong. Present well. If you had seen Goliath, he would have looked like the quintessential modern-day soldier at the time. He was awesome looking and powerful. And that, I tell you, is his form of courage. I'll go into battle, but as I go, I'll bluster. I'll puff up. I'll yell. I'll give insults. I'll degrade the other person. He focuses on his strengths, Goliath does, when he goes into battle. So much more so that I'll explain in the end, he actually makes a strategic blunder because he's so overconfident. He's going into battle with the attitude, I can do this. Rah, rah, rah. I'll conquer it. And you know, if you've ever gone into battles of life like this, you'll get crushed. And he gets crushed. because he overlooks one incredible factor. See, on the one hand, Goliath is a champion. He's going to go stand in between, and he's going to go fight on behalf of his people, but he says, I'll do it with my muscles. I'll do it with my might. I'll do it. I'll just muster up enough strength. But inside, if you notice, he must have been cowering with fear. Here's why, a couple tidbits, if you don't know this. See, most people think David went out with a little sling, like a little kid's sling, oh, that hurt my eye. No. Actually, what they say is that the sling in this case was as strong as, if not stronger, than a bow and arrow, and just as deadly. You could take a rock in one of these slings that's rather long, spin it around, and let it go, and they say you can get up to speeds of 60 miles an hour. Why do you think when Goliath sees David running, he says, come? If Goliath was a true warrior, he would have ran to him. Goliath would have gone to fight him. But when Goliath sees him, he says he's frustrated. And he hates to look at David. There's something about David that strikes mortal fear into Goliath, believe it or not. And see, we conventionally read the story to say, well, Goliath is fear. No, he's not. He's trumped up courage. He's the cowardly lion. You remember the story, Wizard of Oz, of course, and I'm talking about the book, the old 1900 one, not the movies. There's the scarecrow and the Tin Man and the lion, and it gets missed in the movie, although the movie's great, no big deal. But the wonderful Wizard of Oz, you remember this part of the story where Dorothy and the Tin Man and Scarecrow, they come across the lion, and the lion jumps out, right? Rah! Puff chest. Me. Look at me. And he knocks over the Scarecrow because the Scarecrow is stuffed. And later on he says, wait, why did the Scarecrow fall over so easily? And Dorothy says, because he's stuffed. But the minute that the lion's claw, it says, touches the Tin Man, he says, I felt a cold shiver. Because he was a coward. But nobody knew it. Except Dorothy. And there's this interesting interchange in the novel. It says, Dorothy looks at him and says, what makes you a coward? She was looking at the great beast in wonder, for after all, he was as big as a small horse. And the lion replies, it's a mystery. I suppose I was born that way. All the other animals in the forest naturally expect me to be brave. For the lion is everywhere thought to be king of the beast. I learned that if I only roar very loudly enough, every living thing was frightened and got out of my way. Whenever I've met a man, I've been awfully scared, but I just roared away at him. And he was always running away as fast as he could. If the elephants and the tigers and the bears had ever tried to fight me, I should have run myself, for I was sore afraid. I'm such a coward. But just as soon as they hear me roar, they all try to get away from me. And of course, I let them go. And the Scarecrow says, but that shouldn't be. The king of beasts shouldn't be a coward. And the lion, in one of the saddest parts, says, I know it. Wiping a tear from his eye with the tip of his tail. It is my great sorrow, and it makes my life truly unhappy. See, look, Goliath is not the embodiment of your fears. Do you see this now? Rather, he's a false courage. And the problem with a false courage is that when you get found out, it makes you truly very unhappy. You can be the cowardly lion, roar, roar, roar. Every fight that you have to come about in life, every struggle that comes up to you, everything you fear at night or in the morning, whatever are the big fears of your life. You're going to lose your job. You're going to never find a loved one. You're never going to find a spouse. Whatever fears you may have, you can go at it like Goliath and get felled. Do it. Make your chest big. Growl. But the minute your claw touches something of substance, the tin versus the Scarecrow, you'll shiver in fear. Goliath was ill prepared for this, and he knew it. Military strategists who look and commentate on the Old Testament commentators who take into account military strategy point out a simple fact. The way Goliath was dressed, he was dressed for close combat. He was dressed not to move very fast. His armor was heavy. He had a lot of weaponry, so much that he wasn't even carrying a shield. He had another person doing it for him. He was prepared to fight on his terms. And the minute that he sees David with that sling and he knows how fast that thing can go and how deadly it is, he knows he's exposed. One shot to the head will take him down. And this is why he says, why do you treat me like a dog? You come at me with sticks. See what his response to. He's the cowardly lion. Trump up, scream, rah, insult, deflect. Because you know you can't win that way. He even had his shields down. Why do I point out that he had his shields down? I said it was a strategic blunder, and here's why. See, false courage. If I were to just stand up here today and say, listen, guys, whenever you have something fearful come into your life next, just fight through it. Clench your fist, bar your teeth, and get through it. If I just told you that, that's false courage, it's false hope. And what it does to Goliath, and what it'll do to you, is it'll distort your view of reality. You'll ignore reality. Look at what Goliath does. He makes one of the biggest strategic blunders. He's so confident in his might, and he's so confident in his strength, he didn't have a shield. He obviously didn't watch Star Trek. He went in without shields on, shields up, shields down. His shields are down. He's not ready. Why? Because his sense of courage has distorted his view of reality, and therefore he's utterly ill-equipped for the battle. He's not as prepared, although he looks it on the surface. He's not as grounded, although he looks polished. And here's the lesson for you and me today. If you and I approach our life and every fear that comes into our hearts and every battle that we have to struggle against, whatever it may be, personal relationships, jobs, career, reputation, whatever it is that you battle, you can do it the Goliath way. You can do it the cowardly lion way. My strength, my might. But you'll have your shields down, and you won't be able to face the reality of the situation, that you are ill-equipped. Now, that's the Goliath courage. And I belabored that a little bit more than I should, but I wanted to do that intentionally so that you can see maybe today that Goliath is not this big, bad, fearful guy. I think Goliath sees David, and he knows he's in trouble because he's relied on himself to get through the battle. Now, if you don't want Goliath courage, and if you don't want the cowardly lion courage, what's the alternative? Can I tell you this? Have David's courage. Go. Next time something is very fearful in front of you, or next time you're at the bottom of the well, next time you got to ride into the battle, do it like David. Be strong. Trust in God. Yes, that's true, but it'll crush you in the end as well. In order for this story to make sense this afternoon in the time that we have, what I want you to do is this. I want you to put yourself into the narrative. I don't want you to put yourself as Goliath. And I don't want you to put yourself as David, believe it or not. I want you and me to put ourselves in the position of the Israelites. Saul, it says, and all of his men saw this thing come out of the battles. And he was mighty and sophisticated and sleek and polished. And it says that they were dismayed. It means that their knees were knocking. They were afraid. And that's okay. It'd be easy for me to stand up here today and say, never be afraid. Chin up, buck up, go. Be a David. Dare to be a David. And while he's a good example, he's not the one you need to associate with. Put yourself in the position of the Israelites right now for a moment. You're afraid. Okay. What does God do? What does God give his people when they are afraid? He gives them a champion. He gives them a man in between. But this champion doesn't look anything like that champion. This champion's not trained for battle. This champion has been out with the sheep. This champion, if you remember last week, was the eighth child, the forgotten one, the outcast, not invited to the party. This is the champion you never would have expected. And God says, that's who I give for you to go fight your battles. You don't fight them alone. You have a go-between. David was weak in comparison to Goliath. David was ill-equipped, but you know what David was? He was a substitute. God essentially says to his people, you're afraid. He sends David. And you notice David doesn't say, everybody follow me. He never says that once. David never says, everybody follow my example. Never says it. He just goes. David is a legal substitute for the people. He wins. They win. And they didn't do a thing. David was a substitution. He was the legal representative at the time. You see this? And it's a little hard to wrap our brains around, I know, because I don't know if you've been in battle, but I don't think you have, but you've seen battle. We don't do this anymore. We don't send out one person, although it'd be much more expedient and nicer if we probably did do that instead of go all to battle with each other. So you may not understand it, but look at it in this way. We do have one example of this in our modern day lives, and it's the court system. When you get a lawyer, that lawyer is your representative. They're your legal representative. They represent you. They fight your battles. And let me tell you this, if you get a bad lawyer, you're in trouble. Because as the lawyer goes, so do you. He's the substitute. His or her win is your win. Her or his loss is your loss. And this is what God's doing to the people. He says, you're sore afraid. Good. Now, I'll send him, not you, to fight your battles. David and Goliath is a really good story. And you see now there's two ways to handle this. Everything that comes into your life that's a hardship or a struggle or adversity or conflict or you're afraid of, go at it like a Goliath. You get pinged in the head and you'll fall. But don't try to go it necessarily like a David, because you'll feel overwhelmed and under-equipped. But rather see that David went out on behalf of his people. The little shepherd boy from Bethlehem went out, and he didn't look the part. He didn't act the part. Saul, even in the story, if you remember, he tries to dress him up. Saul says, you can't go out like that. You're going to die. So he puts all this armor on him, and Saul tries to make David into the Goliath form of courage. Do you see this? He puts all this armor on him, and David says, I can't do it this way. You want me to fight your battles your way, God says, but I'm going to fight it my way by sending out a new champion, a little champion, a weak one who the world laughs at, but he's going to go fight and conquer every fear and battle that you need. Do you see where I'm going here? David's a substitute. And it's a good story. And it should make you feel good. But then you're saying, well, wait a second, that's David and that's the Israelites. What does this mean for me? Well, the writer of Hebrews tells you what it means for you. In Hebrews chapter 11, he says this, the writer says, what more shall I say? He's been going through a long list of people, all the famous people of the Old Testament. And he's saying, they were great, and he was great, and they were great, and they were great. And he mentions David. He says, for time would fail me to speak of Gideon and Barak, Samson, Jephthah, and of David, who through faith conquered kingdoms, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword. And then he goes on and says, all of these were great and commended through their faith, did not receive what was promised. And he tells you a really important thing here. He says, look, consider David, and he's a good story. But in the end, in Hebrews chapter 12, after talking about David and his courage, and how he stopped the mouths of lions, and he felled the great Goliath, he says, that's not good enough for you. You need someone else. You need the one that David was pointing to. And in Hebrews chapter 12, this is what he says, and let us run with endurance the race that is set before us, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of God. Do you see what the writer is saying here? David's a good story. And wouldn't it be great if I said this afternoon for all of you to run out with all your slings and just sling down every problem you have in life, but you'll have missed the entire beauty of the story, because it's not the people who go fight the battle. It's the champion substitute, the little guy. And the writer of Hebrews says, David's good, but there was one better. Fix your eyes on Jesus. Know that he fights your battles. And he has fought the greatest battle that you'll ever have to face. What are you afraid of? What strikes fear into your heart right now? The lack of love? You get him. The lack of companionship? You get him. The lack of guidance? You get him. Every fear has been conquered by you, by me. Sorry. Him. The substitute champion. His victory is my victory. His victory is yours. And you and I have to start preaching that to our hearts over and over again. You see, David, yes, little boy from Bethlehem, but there was one who came from Bethlehem later, and he was greater. And he runs into all the battles for you, headlong and headstrong. And he says, I'll be your substitute. Stop fighting it your way. Stop putting on the armor. Stop blustering up. Stop pretending and putting on a mask and putting all the armor and pretending that you can get through it. He says, because you have one who already went through it for you. Why do you fight now when he fights for you? David is pointing to the real champion. And this is why David, in Psalm 30, gets to write this line that we read earlier. And I want to reread it to you. Because around this time, we think that this is when he, probably around this time or a little bit later, that he wrote Psalm 30. And he says this, sing praises to the Lord, O you his saints, give thanks to his holy name, for his anger is but for a moment, and his favor is for a lifetime. Weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes in the morning. What's going to give you the amount of courage to say that? When fear comes upon your heart, when struggles come into your life, when adversity smacks you in the face, what's going to get you to say, weeping may tarry for the night, but oh joy, it will come in the morning. It's because you get the answer to fear in Jesus. And let me say it like this, another way, from the book of 1 John. I'll put it this way, little trivia, Bible trivia for you. In the book of 1 John chapter 4, it says, perfect something cast out all fear. Fill in the blank. Perfect something cast out fear. What's the blank? Something cast out fear. Is it perfect courage cast out fear? No. Is it perfect resolution cast out fear? No. Is it perfect being a good Christian and going to church every Sunday cast out all fear? No. It's perfect love cast out fear. As a way to say this, the opposite to fear is not courage. The opposite to fear is love. And you get the one who shows you that love on the cross. He's the substitute, do you see now? He's the one from the backwater town that nobody would have thought. He's the little guy, Jesus says, who becomes the true champion. What do you fear? Nobody would have picked Jesus, just as nobody would have picked David. But you see now, it's not just a story, it's not just a morality play here. It's not a story with a moral. That's not why we're here this afternoon. It's a story of grace and of the gospel. And it's a story to remind your heart of this. You get a champion. And you wouldn't have picked him, and I wouldn't have picked him, but we got him. And he's already beaten the very thing that would strike fear and cold shivers in your spine. Death. Loneliness, alienation, loss, isolation. It comes on him so that you don't have to fight it. There's this line, and I quote this a lot. I just love it. I know, if you've been here and you've heard this before, I whip it out every once in a while, and I just love it. Because, there's a part where Gandalf in the Lord of the Rings, he's talking. He picks, the little Bilbo Baggins for this harrowing mission with the ring. And at the time, Bilbo's a little, not stupid hobbit, but he's definitely not the guy you pick. Nobody would have picked him. He's a halfling. And Gandalf, and all of his profound wisdom as the White Wizard, he picks this guy to go on this mission. And there's this interchange that he has with Galadriel. She's the, I don't even know, you call her the Queen of the Elves? I don't know if she's queen. She's the top lady of the elves. She's smart. She's powerful. She gets it. She's the coolest character, perhaps, in the book. And she looks at Gandalf square in the eyes and she says, Mithrandir, or Gandalf, why the halfling? Why him? And Gandalf gives probably one of the most scripturally relevant answers to how you conquer fear and how you conquer battles. He says this. Gandalf looks at her and says, I don't know. He says, Saruman, he believes that it's only in great power that can hold evil in check. But that's not what I have found. I found it as the small things, everyday deeds of ordinary folk that keeps the darkness at bay. Simple acts of kindness and love. Why, Bilbo Baggins? Perhaps it is because I'm afraid, and he gives me courage. Why, Jesus Christ? Because I'm afraid. He gives me courage. Because he's my substitute. And he is yours today. Go to him now. Praise that substitution. See your champion run out to battle for you so that you need not go to the battle anymore. Go in silence now and pray over that.